It is RT International live from Moscow. Thank you for joining us. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has made an unannounced visit to Moscow overnight, meeting with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. It is the first trip abroad for the Syrian leader since 2011. The pair discussing the fight against terror and extremist groups. Russia's air operation currently being carried out in Syria was touched upon as well. Let's, in fact, have a quick listen as to what the two leaders had to say at the meeting.
The Syrian people practically by themselves have been fending off and fighting against international terrorism for several years now. Syria has been having serious losses, but lately it's been achieving serious positive results in this struggle as well.
I would like to thank Russia's leadership and the Russian people for all the help they've given to Syria. Thank you for standing up for Syria and its independence. The most important thing is that it's done within international law. If not for your actions, terrorism that's now engulfed the region would have spread even further to a greater number of countries.
All right, Medina Kochanova now joining me live with more details on this surprise visit between the Syrian and Russian leaders. Medina, you'd imagine they probably had quite a lot to talk about.
Well, of course, and according to the reports, the negotiations were indeed quite lengthy, and it was a very unexpected visit, well, at least for the media. But what we know so far is that, just as you mentioned, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has visited Moscow for a working visit and has held negotiations with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, according to the Kremlin spokesman, now the Syrian leader informed his counterpart on the situation in Syria, on the situation on the ground, and both sides also discussed some further plans how to stabilize the situation. Now, Vladimir Putin once again stressed the growing threat of the spread of international terrorism, and he said that this issue has also put Russia's national interests, Russia's security interests at stake here as well. Now, the president explained why.
The attempts of international terrorism to control large territories in the Middle East and to destabilize the situation in the region draw concerns in many countries. Russia is also concerned about this, especially considering that there are at least 4,000 armed fighters who are now battling the Syrian government and are from the former Soviet republics. Of course, we cannot allow them to gain the experience at war and being ideologically influenced suddenly appear on Russian territory.
Well, very few details have come out of the negotiations room late on Tuesday. Now, of course, the agenda of the meeting was clearly understandable. According to the Kremlin spokesman, both sides discussed the situation in Syria and the current fight against the spread of ISIL in the region.
All right, RT's Medina Kochanova. Thank you. Well, let's get more on this now from peace researcher and NATO expert Daniel Ganzer joining us here live on RT International as we have this very fluid day of breaking news and a big surprise visit. Good to see you today. We had this unannounced visit in the overnight hours, downtown Moscow, the Kremlin, Assad, Putin sitting down. It does, according to some analysts, signify something important. How do you read what was a clandestine meeting?
I think the meeting just shows that Putin doesn't want to see Assad fall. There's nothing new to it, really. That was clear before, and showing that the two leaders sort of show themselves in front of the camera just shows that Putin doesn't want to see Assad fall. Nothing new.
There's nothing new in your eyes here, though, after the past approximate 2 weeks of Russian air campaigns over Syria and dozens upon dozens of alleged terrorist targets hit and destroyed. One might imagine they were discussing perhaps about progress being made in the current battle against Islamic State.
Of course, they share a common enemy. You have to keep in mind that Syria has about 10% Christians only. And these Christians are being killed by the IS radicals, as they really are. And Putin doesn't want that. He doesn't want to see the Christians killed in Syria. And he doesn't want to have the militant radical Sunni fighters, the Islamic State, move into Russian territory, Chechnya, etc. So they have a common goal, and I think really that's what brings them together. Also, Russia doesn't want to lose its military base, Tartus, that it has in Syria. So they're linked by common interests.
Well, common interests, certainly the main one, as you mentioned there, that of anti-terrorism. The issue of the war on terror, something that we've heard, the rhetoric out of Washington, D.C., that it should be a global war against those who oppose the West and so many of its ideologies. Why is it that we've seen Washington almost take a step back and almost allow Russia to take the leading role in Syria when all the time along it's always been the American-led coalition against the members of ISIL or IS?
Well, you know, this so-called, I always say, so-called war on terrorism is something very, very strange, really. People here in Switzerland, also in Germany, in the US, and in many parts of the world don't understand when this Syria war started and who is fighting there. It's just a huge mess to everybody. And I usually point out that the moment when the Syrian war really started was in 2003, because that's when the US attacked Iraq together with the British and overthrew Saddam Hussein. And at that moment, Assad was saying, no, don't do it. You know, it's going to destabilize the whole region. And many people said, no, you know, it has to be done. He's a dictator. He has to go. And today we see that Assad was absolutely right, because Iraq and Syria, they share a very, very long border. They both have minorities, Shia and Sunni in the different countries. And actually, the war in Iraq triggered this whole thing that we have now in Syria. So I don't think the war on terrorism is always what it seems to be. It's just that everybody who's killing somebody is saying, you know, he's a terrorist, we have to kill him. That's really the new phrase. It's being used to justify brutality.
Dictator, terrorism, terrorist, all sorts of various words that are very useful to sell headlines. What, freedom fighters, insurgents, terrorists, democracy, this, that and the other. We've all heard it before. The question, though, Dr. Ganser, is you talk about the common goals here, the anti-terror operations. You were saying a moment ago that Assad was right. He told America not to go into Iraq in 2003. Yes. He predicted the outcome, and you're saying he was right of the turmoil that's taken over the Middle East. And yet the US has said many times that Assad is a dictator, that Assad has to go. In fact, just for a moment, let's listen to the US State Department with their rhetoric.
For obvious reasons, he cannot be a part of the solution here in terms of that transitional government that does emerge. But we've not said that he has to leave tomorrow, that he can't be part of the transitional process.
Why do you think Washington has been so against President Assad for years now, since 2003?
You have to look at it from an international perspective. The US is the most powerful nation on the planet. They are the empire, the US empire. And they've been engaging in regime change, which means toppling of governments for many, many years. They've toppled the government in Iran in 1953. They've toppled the government of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And now they tried to topple Assad. But they failed. They toppled the government probably in Ukraine, as Ray McGovern says. But this strategy of regime change is something that in Syria now doesn't work. Why has it failed? A number of reasons. Because in Syria, the US was in the very embarrassing situation that they wanted to topple Assad. But in order to topple Assad, they had to side with the radicals, okay? With the radicals, with the terrorists, with the IS, with the al-Nusra, call them what you want. But they had to side with Sunni extremists. Now, these Sunni extremists were also supported by Saudi Arabia. And obviously, the US, Obama and Kerry and anybody else from the executive could not step forward and say, we support ES because they topple Assad. They couldn't say that. So they always made this very strange mix of communication by saying, yes, we want to topple Assad, but we also want to fight ES. And that was always bewildering to every peace researcher or historian who looked at the situation. So I think they did not have a clear strategy in Syria.
Well, you talk about the lack of a possible clear strategy, Dr. Ganser. We know that in the past 10 days or so, when Russia was known to the entire world that it was helping Assad with these air campaigns over Syria, we then learned from the Pentagon, from Washington, that 50 tons of weapons were dropped to the so-called moderate rebels to assist in their job against the terrorists, against the Assad government. How do you read into that? Russia helping with air campaigns against Islamic State, and in the past 10 days, the Pentagon drops over 20 pallets with 50 tons of weapons into Syria. Where do they go?
Yeah, where do they go? And who knows where they go? I mean, the Pentagon always says, oops, that's a mistake. We didn't want to drop any weapons to the IS. I mean, they always say we don't support the radical enemies of Assad. We support the moderate enemies of Assad. But that has always been a very difficult distinction to make. We have people in Iraq who have come forward many years ago already who said, you know, there are being weapons dropped by the British, by the US. That is confirmed. And then they say, and these weapons, they went directly in the hands of the IS. And, you know, if you want terrorists, I don't call them terrorists, I call them radical Sunni fighters. And you know, why would the US support them? Because, you know, some say if the US is able to topple Assad, that will be in the US interest. But from Washington, we've never had, you know, the confirmation that they support the US to topple Assad. They never said that. Why didn't they say that? Because that would then mean that they cooperate with terrorism. And they can't say that, and they can't do that. So I've said before, and I repeat it here, the word terrorism is always used by governments to just say these are our enemies. And you will see that all over the world. That's the same. It's the language. It's really a semantic war that we look at here.